constructor is a special function which have these properties. Okay. First property that it will call automatically. Second property that the purpose of this function is to create the object. It means that when the object is created, then the function will be called automatically. This is the second property of a constructor. Third property of a constructor is that the constructor, which is a member function, it will has the same name as the class. For example, if the class has a name rectangle, then the member function will also have the constructor will also have a name rectangle. So the class name and the constructor name will be same. This is third property of a constructor. Fourth property, that this mostly functions have return type, but this will be such a function, such a member function, which will not have any return type. This is the fourth property of a constructor. So a member function which is called automatically when the object is created, and it has the same name as that of a class and no return type, is called constructor. Let me show you an example of constructor. Let's suppose we have a class, a rectangle. This is the same rectangle class that we discussed before. This class has two data members, length and width, and a few setter and getter functions. Like set data function, this is a setter function. It will set the length and width of a class. Get length a function, and get width function, and area function, and this function is defined outside the class. Okay, now to define a constructor, so as we discussed, that constructor is a member function. So we are defining in the public area because it is a function. Okay, and second point, that this function will have the same name as that of a class. So it's will have the same name like a class, rectangle and rectangle. So this will be a function. You see, and the third point, that you see, it will not have any return type. We are not typing here like void or int or float. No, it will not have any return type. Okay, so just as for clarity, I will just display a message here. Okay, see out. Hi, I am a constructor, and call when the object was created. Okay, so you see, the same name is that of a class. It doesn't have any return type. We are not calling this function, but this message will display when an object is created here. So if we create one object, then it will call one time. If we create another object, it will call again, because whenever object is created, constructor will be called. It will call again third time, and for the fourth object, it will call again four times. So this message will display four times when these four objects are created. And you see, we are not calling the function like this. Here you see, we are calling the get length function, we are calling the get width and get area functions, but the constructor function we didn't call, but still it will be called automatically, and it doesn't have any return type. So let's save it and run. You see, four times. I am a constructor and called when the object was created. So one time, second time, third time, and fourth time, because there are four objects uh, of this class. This constructor which don't have any argument is called default constructor. Is here in the parenthesis list, like you see, this data function has two arguments. This is called argument. So any constructor which don't have any argument, it is called default constructor. So default constructor is a constructor that takes no argument. Okay, and if let's suppose we don't write any, if you write a class with no constructor at all, C++ will write for us. So it means the default constructor, if we didn't provide, if we didn't write, the C++ will write the default constructor for us. A simple instantiation of a class with no arguments calls the default constructor. So whenever we are creating an object and it is a simple creation of object, we are not passing any values here. Sometimes we are passing values here like this. Okay. we can pass values like this. But if we don't pass values, at that time the default constructor will be called. Okay, so second option, if we want to pass arguments to a constructor, then we can. So meaning to say that it will be a constructor, but we can pass arguments. So a rectangle and some arguments, and we can define this one also. So it means, let me show you a practical example, that if we want, like let's suppose a rectangle, and I want to pass arguments like float L, comma, float width, and here I will pass and I will initialize the data members like length equal to L and width equal to W. Okay, now you see it's the same type of constructor, meaning to say it is also a constructor, but it has some arguments. Okay, so this is called passing arguments to a constructor. Now we have two options because we have two constructors. So when we are creating objects, then we have two options. We can create object without any initial value, and we can create objects with initial value. So when we are creating object without initial value, then the default constructor will be called. And when we are we are creating objects with some initial values, then the overloaded constructor will be called. This is called overloaded constructor also. Okay, overloaded means that as functions which have same name but different arguments. So for example, here is no argument, but and here are two arguments. So such a functions which have different arguments or different return type, such functions are called overloaded functions. So the same concept apply on constructor also. So constructor which have different arguments are called overloaded constructors. So for now, if we when we are creating an object, then we have two options now. For example, we are not passing any values here, so the default constructor will be called. But in this case, if I want to pass a default values or some initial values, for example 5 and 2, so you see this time the second constructor which have arguments, that will be called, meaning to say the overloaded constructor will be called. The 5 will pass to the first argument, L, and the 2 will copy to the second argument W, and then it will be assigned to the data members. So we have two type of constructor, without arguments and with arguments. So if we have more than one constructor, it is called overloaded constructor. So let's save it and run it. For this purpose, I think I should display the message here also, that we see I am an overloaded constructor. Overloaded constructor. Okay, save it and run it. So we will see that this message will be, you see, the three objects we created without initial values. Okay, let me show you here. You see, 1, 2, and 3. So these three we created without values. So in that case, the default constructor is called, okay, 3 times, because without initial values. But one object we created with some default initial values, at that time the overloaded constructor was called. Okay, so there are different type of constructor with arguments and without arguments. The without argument is called default constructor. Default default constructor. There is another type of default constructor also. Let's see here. Let me show you. Like this one. For example, if all of the constructor parameters, the arguments, have default arguments like this, you see, like this, then the default that constructor is also called default constructor. And note the point, the class must have only one default constructor. Let me create another one. Okay, first of all, let me define once again. So any constructor which have arguments, but the argument have default values. When there is equality option and there is some value there, like this, during the arguments type, okay, when we are defining the arguments and at that time we provide default values, this is called default argument. So any constructor which have default argument, the constructor become default constructor. Okay, so there are now again two possibilities to define default constructor. One without arguments like this, and one with default arguments like this. So let's try another default constructor. Let me define here rectangle, and now here I am passing default values. For example, float L equal to, you see here I'm using equality, equal to 5 comma float width equal to 2, and now here I'm assigning this to the length equal to L, and width equal to W. Okay, like this. But oh sorry, this should be comma. Yeah, so length and width. But you see, if I save it, it will give me an error because now the compiler is confused among two default constructor. One is this default constructor and one is this one is also default constructor because of the default argument. So when we are creating objects without any initial values, at the time compiler is, is confused that which default constructor should be called. So if you come here, you see all the three objects that we are creating without arguments have underline red line. Why? Because this will call a default constructor and we have two default constructors, so which one should be called? The compiler cannot decide. Okay, same goes for this, same goes for this, but this one don't have any problem because it is calling the overloaded constructor. Okay, this one. So if it is calling the overloaded constructor, so no issue. So it means that in a class we can only have one default constructor. So you see, if I delete this, okay, if I cut this, now you will see, and if I save this one, you will see that the red line gone, and even here the red line gone. If just for clarity, if I paste again, you see you will get the red lines once again. This is because of the confusion among two default constructors. Okay, so if I remove it and save it, it will go away again. So there are two type of default constructors. Let me just quickly run to show you the how. This time let me delete because it is the same thing. Again, you see this one has two arguments and this one has also two arguments. So this is another problem. So let's just remove this and run again. Yeah, so you see it's working now. Okay, and if you want to create some message, to define some message here, like for example cout, and define constructor, save it and run it. So this message will define four times, 1 2 3 4. Why? Because when we are creating this argument, sorry, this object, so it will call a default constructor, and the default constructor is the same only one. This time will also default constructor. So any function or any constructor which have default argument, if we don't pass any value, then these values will be used which is already here. Let me make it different from the one, then should be more clear. So if we don't pass any value here, then the default values will be used like 10 and 2. And if we pass some values here, then this value will override these values. Like the 10 will replace by 5 and the 2 will replace by 2 here. So like that. And here with no arguments, so the default values will be used. So default constructors may be default constructors are of two types, one with no arguments and one with default arguments. And there are overloaded constructor means that if we have several constructors but these constructors have differences on the basis of arguments, so that is called overloaded constructor.